6:05, here we go. Okay. Welcome all to the Launch Your Philosophy Foundation's first Continental Chop Shop. It's a mouthful, where we will reorient ourselves with the foundational terminology around which the tradition revolves, or the conversations within the tradition revolve. Today's topic is authenticity. We're going to begin with some Husserl and move forward chronologically from there. My name is Kelly Animal Birchfield, and I'm here to present on Husserl. I'm going to dive right in. Okay. So while Husserl does not specifically write in detail about the term authenticity, his philosophical journey into what he deems the dark enigma of subjectivity, beyond the realm of the obvious and the self-evident, represents the term's essence, man's Promethean struggle for his truth, as he writes, the struggle to make himself true. And what he finds along his path fastens for conversations to come a current take on an originating philosophical theme, that of freedom, understood by Husserl to be the origin of man's capacity to secure rational meaning for his individual and common human existence. According to Husserl, the methods and assumptions of modern philosophy have obscured this capacity, rendering its prodigious heir, the turn-of-the-century European, in a state of crisis, their physics and psychology unable to illuminate the basic grounds of enlightenment, though their deepest predications tout tautology, their progress and productivity quite pronounced. Precisely because they believe to have already divined the rational structures of the mind in relation to the laws of nature, the moderns set into motion a restrictive, logically positivistic precedence of objective measure, which according to Husserl banned from the realm of science the specifically human questions which spiritually motivate scientific inquiry in the first place. What Husserl identifies as Galileo's mathematization of nature, a pernicious version of the natural attitude is introduced into the cultural landscape of natural philosophy. Its fact-minded, straightforward stance towards the world glosses over cumbersome questions of the meaning or meaninglessness of the whole of this human existence, yielding swift, efficient empirical observation and induction. Its universal principles dazzled the moderns with seemingly universal appeal, and an ideal praxis of pure thinking overtakes natural philosophy, according to Husserl. And over time, natural philosophy becomes ever the more sedimented in facts. It ever so subtly divorces itself from philosophy altogether, until, as science proper, it practically renounces its original telos, its deeper motivations of aiding man in his unrelenting process of coming to rational completeness, of becoming what Husserl calls a free, self-determining being in his behavior toward the human and extra-human surrounding world, and as he says, free in regard to his capacities for rationally shaping himself and his surrounding world. As the standards of the natural attitude become the standards for all of science, the standards for all of science become the standard of belief for the turn-of-the-century European, infecting the total worldview of man. As Husserl writes, merely fact-minded sciences make merely fact-minded people. And while he writes, he claims mankind is theoretically predetermined, understanding itself naturalistically, the objective world, man's cognition within it, ready-made, already complete, the process of becoming having come to its final end. Freed from cumbersome questions, man is no longer a problem for himself within the scientific sphere. However, the scientific man now finds himself trapped in an infinite and, yet self-enclosed world of objects, of history's making, out of touch with the lived experience, out of which any value, scientific or otherwise, doth arise. Caught up in a spell of rigidly defined actuality and necessity, man's possible modes of being run dry. Unimaginative, he is unable to make sense of neither fact nor fiction, He is ill-equipped to tackle the unattended questions of his problematic being in this world, having festered like growing pustules upon his spirit. He is unable to reasonably cope with the world's state of affairs without succumbing to the extremes of dogma, absurdity, or inescapable skepticism. For though deep down he desires to do so, he is unable to gaze upon his own predicament firsthand and with fresh eyes. As the scientific man must condition his empirical sight upon a predetermined, abstract conception of a factual world and a factual self. He cannot, as Husserl puts it, immediately gaze upon the things themselves without either subconsciously or overtly referencing, mediating mechanical models of reality and inner being. Such a state of affairs motivates inauthentic, unhealthy, irrational, disharmonious beliefs and bodies of knowledge, motivates inauthentic, unhealthy, irrational, disharmonious cultures, an inauthentic, unhealthy, irrational, disharmonious way of life. Science, in all its purported third-person objective glory, is not immune to the spiritual disease of the inauthenticity suffered by the turn-of-the-century European man, which Husserl outlines. Though the efficiency-minded natural attitude certainly has inspired technological advancement beyond the early modern man's wildest dreams, and natural science's rigidly defined empirical facts about the natural world have led to medical advancements curing diseases once believed to be insurmountable, science as a practice, according to Husserl, has in no way produced any of the universal substantive explanations about the nature of man or the inner workings of the universe, which it seeks and sometimes even claims to have found. Its practice of universally reducing reality and existence of the mind and nature to material facts of matter renders the whole of experience, the world, and the objects within it products of mere obvious sense data, which theoretically cannot account for the spontaneous acts of life and measure upon which empirical observation logically rests. Husserl claims that the model of sense data can in no way account for how it is universality arises within the realm of mathematics or theoretical physics, and can in no way account for the power of the subject to organize that data in a rational, holistic way. The world of sensuous experience is in constant flux. Establishing facts upon those grounds is like building castles of sand right on the edge of the beach. Where is the science of logic in that? And what can we know about the origin of the free subject which measures under the model of naturalism? How can we inquire into the legitimacy of our conclusions about the world which we sense, or our application of mathematical principles to what we sense, if the depth of our sight does not go beyond mere sense data? If our ideal freedom to measure the world objectively is dependent on mere sense data, and if the relationship between pure ideal mathematics and the world which we sense is presupposed as naturally, obviously mechanical. If a scientist cannot see for themselves the origin of the values which they apply, if they cannot see for themselves the relationship between the subject which measures and the objects measured within the immediate act of measuring itself, in what sense is their body of knowledge scientific and not dogmatic, predicated on obvious assumptions, the origins of which, when closely inspected, are not so obvious? Under the tutelage of the natural attitude, the sight of the scientist is situated abstractly in an idealized third-person point of view, so that they cannot touch the world which they measure and cannot immediately gaze upon the emergence of their scientific values by which any act of measuring gains sense for them. While Husserl writes, at least according to Husserl, the natural sciences and science proper is so far removed from their philosophical home base that they cannot see just how divorced they are from themselves. And like the mythical Dionysus, science negates and fragments itself infinitely so so that each of its members can hardly communicate efficiently with each other. In belief and action, the naturalistic European, under the tutelage of scientific culture, mirrors such discord and fragmentation. At the turn of the century, and I would argue that still to this day, science no longer serves its original end. It lost its telos when it no longer deemed the study of telos necessary to the scientific endeavor. Consequently, it no longer serves the ends of rationality, freedom, and harmony. It rather serves to perpetuate the literal end of humanity, the ends of war and want. But Husserl has hope for science and scientific culture. We are not as trapped as we seem. He believes that through his phenomenological method, his epoche, we may uncover the dithyramb which still unites the fragments of science, the fragments of philosophy, and the fragments of man deep beyond the realm of obvious notice, operating behind the scenes and the structures of perception. And we may use the tools of modern philosophy at our disposal to enact his method and bring those fragments into a more intimate, authentic, truly efficient communion. Figures such as Descartes and Kant came close to finding the radical grounds of subjectivity, which may account for the emergence of objective measure and lead to rational well-being and a thriving, authentic scientific community. With the breadcrumbs they left, we may trace our way back to an original sphere of consciousness, pregnant with potential dimensions of thoughts and modes of givenness beyond those occasioned by mere sense perception, and which hold the key to efficiently communicating with other conscious beings, no matter how drastically different their personal world of experience, value, and methods of measure might be. His epoche involves 2 steps of reduction. However, the type of reduction found in Husserl's method do not resemble the type of reduction found in the natural sciences, or at least as Husserl construes them. His phenomenology seeks first not to principally explain objects of experience, not to principally explain the foundations of consciousness for psychology, but to describe experience in terms of things themselves as they originally appear as phenomena without the weight of predicated explanations, and to witness the foundations of consciousness as they emerge alongside those objects of experience. To secure a space wherein we may observe these active grounds without disturbing them, the first step to his epoche calls for a change in attitude. We must transition into what he calls a phenomenological attitude. To make this transition, we borrow a move from Descartes, albeit with a slight twist. Instead of doubting the obvious principles of reality and existence, which we have naturalized over the centuries so that we reach the free and radical thinking subject, the subject which allows for objective scientific measure, we merely suspend belief in those principles. We merely put them out of play, he writes, so that they no longer are the sole determinations of our perceptual faculties. If we were to doubt them completely, as Descartes did, or does, then we would not be able to observe how it is they positively emerge and how it is they become into the seat of power which they currently possess, at least according to Husserl. By suspending these principles of existence and reality imposed upon our perception by the natural attitude, they become possible principles among many principled stances which we might take towards ourselves and the world. How do we put them out of play, though? How does one begin to free perception from principles so sedimented into our beliefs that they define the bounds of all possible reality and existence, especially without completely obliterating them, in such a way which leaves them intact for scientific observation? Husserl advises us to strike at the heart of the matter, to begin with our treatment of bodies, given that the natural attitude's basic doxic system begins with a reduction of general perceptual entities to natural bodies. A simple change in our comportment towards bodies will achieve the first step in his epoche. And we begin with the body closest to us, the one which is present at the origin of all perceptual acts, the one which has been with us from the beginning, our own bodies. This is a particularly efficient move because our own bodies provide the first clue into our problematic existence within this world, one which is covered over in the natural treatment of bodies, the problematic nature with which we must consciously reunite. Our origin of our problematic existence so eagerly awaits our attention that our attitude will practically change itself as soon as we ask the right questions. Our bodies are natural bodies, yes. They are subject to the same causal necessities as other entities in the world, right? This much our sense perception provides. But our bodies are at the same time not like other bodies we encounter. They appear to be moved by more than mere mechanical forces. This is how we experience our bodies, right? As our own bodies, as our personal bodies, to do with as we choose. A person is associated with our experience of our bodies, which eludes naturalistic reductions, rebels against them even. And yet in the European scientific culture, we choose to define ourselves upon natural principles solely. Why? Why, when our first person empirical evidence points to other conclusions involving individual will and freedom? Why, when the accuracy of our scientific measurement depends on deep-seated predications of one, a perceptual sight more pure than what is afforded the mere byproduct of electrified slabs of cranial meat, and two, the freedom to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, have we fallen into the habit of reducing the lived body to a mere spatial entity subject to the natural laws of cause and effect in our explanations and belief systems about the self? How do such conclusions logically follow? And how can we even tell if such conclusions logically follow if the perception by which we cognitively apply the principles of logic to this world is reduced to the powers afforded the mere byproduct of electrified slabs of cranial meat? With those simple questions based upon simple natural observations, we find ourselves in the mood. We are primed to perform Husserl's first phenomenological reduction, our first step towards achieving the pre-predicative, non-judgmental, descriptively bound phenomenological attitude involves suspending not theoretical principles, but practical ones. We must suspend what Husserl calls the personalistic attitude, wherein under the theoretical guidance of the natural attitude, the unique characteristics of the individuals are excluded from universal logical categories like man or person, under the pretense that doing so establishes an objective third-person perspective, which one ought to undertake when seeking rational edification and motivations. The personalistic attitude determines how we form our conception of self as some particular man or some particular person, and how we form our concepts of others. Purportedly, it leads to understanding the self and others through the apodictic universal conception of man as rational, an ideal aim which allows us to recognize and overcome our individual perceptual aberrations, the faults and folly to which each mind is susceptible, hence Descartes' method of doubt. But according to Husserl, this one leads to a distrust of the positive impacts which the dirty yet very much real first-person hermeneutical perspective plays in determining a legitimate body of knowledge, a perspective which provides the vehicle for encountering and becoming familiar with what are considered objective scientific standards in the first place. And if those standards are shaped in the image of the logically apodictic third-person perspectives, such a distrust renders that apodictic standard practically impossible to achieve in any field. And two, it renders any input the unique individual perspective may bring to the table in establishing the universal categories of man or person, and it renders such categories empty, merely formal, and hardly predicative of the conditions of objectivity within this world. When we step away from the impersonal, personalistic attitude, We can see for ourselves firsthand how it is we measure up against universal categories such as man or person, and how we can positively make use of those categories for ourselves, instead of damning ourselves for never living up to what we paradoxically define to be our essence, and explaining away our damnation as the price one pays for merely being the byproduct of an electrified slab of cranial meat and circumstance. And we can see how it is such categories come to be, come to meaning, come to make sense in our perceptual field through our practice of applying them. When we step away from the personalistic attitude, we open ourselves up to see how it is we embody ideas, how it is we are animated by them, and how we change our stance towards such ideas, and how it is our embodiment changes once we change that stance. We are now in what Husserl calls the spirit realm, and here we are empowered by our willed potential, or our potential of will. With our individual person identified and well secured from naturalistic judgment within this spirit realm, Husserl claims we are ready to take on the next step of this phenomenological reduction, that is, fully achieve the phenomenological attitude and reap the benefits of that completion, or the completion that that attitude brings. We take on the boss, so to speak. We suspend the natural attitude itself. And unlike the practical personalistic attitude, the natural attitude is theoretically predicated, though it does inform practice. It is a general, naive stance we take towards the world as something pre-given, as something existing as it does, at our disposal, predetermined through causal laws of time and space. The natural attitude is something unthematic and which shapes our understanding of everyday affairs through apperception, operating in the background as we go about our daily lives. Under the natural attitude, we experience this world of objects as existing in and of itself, and we contribute to the concept of the world through acts of self-interest. And there's nothing inherently wrong with the natural attitude itself. In fact, for the most part, going about life in an unreflective manner is quite necessary for survival. But for the natural attitude to take over as the reigning attitude of the sciences and philosophy sets a bad precedence that has led to the crisis Husserl notes, the results of which I mentioned above. When natural laws are taken not only to mirror, but mistakenly believed to be the exemplar for all the sciences, both pure and natural, then the natural attitude has gone too far. The original foundations of logic, the natural attitude must be put back in its place. When it is put back in its place, we can see the full original foundations of logic and science. We may then use logic and science properly, that is, rationally, to become whole. When the realm of other possible modes of existing in this world are provided room to positively participate in the construction of general logical categories, as they rightfully should, given that diverse perspectives constitute objectivity in the first place, as we shall soon find within the phenomenological attitude, we can truly engage in authentic science. Given our habit of allowing the natural attitude to determine the whole of our beliefs about reality and to set the terms of our intellectual motivations, this step of the reduction will be tricky to implement. But if we remember our original point of questioning our personal bodies, then we shall be able to achieve the phenomenological attitude. Our bodies are, my body is not solely motivated by natural laws of succession and causality. Human bodies are motivated by other forces of cognition, which the natural attitude cannot capture, and which are not subject to the laws of what we usually define as objective time and space. Something else gives us a sense of direction. Something else makes us free from being completely defined in natural terms. We saw this in the spirit realm whenever, by taking a different stance towards the concepts which usually define us, we changed how we experienced and moved our bodies. And by merely acknowledging that there is something else at play directing our experience of our lived bodies, by acknowledging that I exist in another way besides a natural way, and that I have the power to change my stance towards the world, I acknowledge a different sense of necessity, of reality, of telos, which is inseparable from my experience, and which is inseparable from the general conception of necessity, which determines logical necessity writ large, and which we must take into account if we are to account for how it is we can even properly apply logic to the world. Around us, to gain authentic, objective knowledge. What is it that allows for me to take on different perspectives towards the same natural world which I experience day in and day out? It cannot be something within objective time and space as Kant defines it, for it is not subject to the laws of time and space. And though it does not play by the necessary, that is, causal laws of natural existence and the succession of time, it must necessarily be very real if it's to condition, or at least cause in a broader sense, meaning, sense, and objective measure. This very thing is not a thing as we usually think of objects in the world. It is a pure transcendental consciousness, which is intentional in its essence. That is to say, according to Husserl, consciousness in its purity, no matter the stance it takes towards the world or any object within it, is a directedness towards something. It's a directedness towards some object. And when we suspend the belief in our naive conceptions of existence and reality and imagine things as existing in any other way than the way in which they obviously do, we are able to see this purity firsthand and henceforth able to change stances to fit our individual needs more effectively. Under the guidance of the phenomenological attitude, we are able to gaze upon our absolute selves in full. That is, subject, object, and the interrelation between the two, all three in free play within the eternal now of internal time consciousness, which constitutes the phenomena of experience, which constitutes the world horizon of possibilities, the natural possibility being one of many. Husserl calls this relationship the cogito, cogitatio, and cogitatum, that is the ego, the conscious acts of the ego, and the objects of thought towards which those conscious acts are directed. The cogitatum is composed of noema, that is concrete sense, the pure active structures of relating the subject to the object he calls noesis. Objective sense is something that is created over time, as is a sense of self. As we experience an enduring object, we experience it from many angles. And together those angles of the same object become adumbrations of memory. Each past experience of a given object is synthesized with any present experience of it, and present experiences become synthesized with memories in the moment Husserl deems the just now past, which eventually falls into the dark abyss of what no longer is. Given that the ever-present now of perception never changes shape, as it is not subject to the flow of time, it only occasions time's becoming, we may theoretically reach into the abyss of memory and pull out any given past now, bring it to the present, and note how an object has changed while remaining the same, and how we along with it have changed and grown, yet remain the same at our core. That which remains the same through the flux of change and time is an essence. And essence plays just as important a role in establishing the nomadic sense, the concrete sense for an individual's experience, as does the input of sense data. Essence establishes the possibility of objectivity, and essence is shaped by the absolute subject situated in the now. Absolute logical necessity, then, is accessed by sifting through the rhythms of time consciousness. Objective measure is conditioned not by universal concepts or ideas by themselves, and it is not conditioned by objective time and natural cause and effect, but rather absolute logical necessity is conditioned through the universalizing essences which synthesize the appearance of objects and concepts associated with them spontaneously through imaginative free variation. And we need to be able to access the pure realm of eidetic thought, or the realm of essences, to properly, that is scientifically, account for how it is we apply concepts to the world and objects we experience within it. That is, in order to establish authentic grounds for scientific knowledge, we need to keep track of the origins of our concepts, our ideas, ideals, and conclusions, whether they are founded on sense data, essences, other concepts, beliefs, imaginings, feelings, what have you, in order to lay claim to a substantive, authentic scientific body of knowledge. For under the tutelage of the natural attitude, at least according to Husserl, science, no matter its form or practice, cannot do so. And since it cannot do so, it cannot authentically call its practices, conclusions, and beliefs rational or science-based. And since it cannot do so, it has no business in forming a culture which seeks to be scientific. Oops. According to Husserl, we become accustomed to keeping time with the emergence of concepts, ideas, ideals, and conclusions by taking a solipsistic turn towards the heart of our individual internal time consciousness, where we may see for ourselves how objects originally appear, how they gain sense, how they are associated with ideas, how it is ideas relate to each other, and how it is essences relate to each other in their own pure eidetic realm, all within our own individual sphere of immediacy. And we must understand how it is our memory and expectations work together, both in tension and in harmony, to create sense within our own little life worlds, in order to understand how it is we also create sense intersubjectively, that is, together with other egos. Since other egos operate on their own individual time signatures, so to speak, dealing with their own internal tensions and harmonies, creating their own little world from the likes of essences and sense data and synthesis through imaginative free variation of their experiences, we must establish firm, rational channels of empathy based on our common structures of time to ensure that we are directing ourselves towards a common world and creating common ends harmoniously. Equipped with eidetic insight, that is, equipped with the sight of essences, at least according to Husserl, we are free to inspect our whole condition, both individually and communally, and account for the origins of our scientific units of measure. We can then ensure that our units of measure may always be traced back to our home world, so to speak, which is composed of many realities, many worlds. After performing his phenomenological reduction, at least according to Husserl, we may return to our natural endeavors enriched with a fuller understanding of ourselves as rational beings, yet always beings who are becoming, always struggling for the creation of truth, even in fields of science which erroneously believe themselves to be closing in on perfect universal knowledge, and in reuniting scientific measure with realistic expectations, that is, with its true objective origins in eidetic, imaginative free variation. Our logical categories can be full of sense instead of nonsense once more. We may properly make use of those categories and come to sound conclusions without succumbing to the extremes of dogma, absurdity, or skepticism. Well grounded through phenomenology and not too full of itself, science can go on to serve its original end and remember its spiritual origins and motivations. Natural science really is philosophy. We ought to start calling it that again if we are to be authentic about what we are really doing here. Once science becomes phenomenological, once the many fields of science are united through standards of measure established by the science of essences, then the natural sciences and any other science partaking of that standard may extend itself as an exemplar for practitioners, at least according to Husserl. So that's my presentation on Husserl and authenticity. And it's definitely a robust account, and which leads to the very robust continental conversation. And I'm very excited to hear the next presentation on Heidegger. First, I guess, is there any discussion on this? As the purported experts in the field, which I have gathered here today, maybe we don't have much to discuss. And had we had more newbies in on the conversation, there would be more questions.
Yeah, so sometimes Husserl talks about different numbers of reductions. So you really got into two. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how he sort of shifts around a little bit in terms of like what reductions you're doing? When?
Yeah. The reductions are something we have to perpetually perform if we're to keep track of the origins of our concepts. Some concepts are based on direct sense data. Some concepts are based on other concepts, and some concepts are based on these essences. So in order to keep track of what it is we're seeing within the eidetic realm, whenever we've isolated ourselves from natural judgments, or at least succumbing to those natural judgments, we need to be perpetually perform these reductions to keep track of everything. So so the first step is to suspend belief about your personal ideas of self, which are socially conditioned. And then the next step is to suspend belief about reality, specifically about the world as a container, as there being an inside, an outside, an inner world versus an outer world. The phenomena just is. And so that's very slippery, and it's very easy to accidentally confuse an inductively derived concept or conclusion with a deductively derived one. So if it's deductively derived, it's abstract, it's higher order, it has its basis on other concepts. And if it's inductively derived, it has its basis in sense data. So we have to always be sure to remain close to home, that is, and make sure we're not projecting our own vision of the world or what we would like the world to be in order to observe the phenomena as it's given in its possibilities, or its raw givenness, I guess. Which I think is hard to do given given the conditions Husserl has set up. And I won't go into it too much, but it's the law and share philosophy's metaphysics to believe that you need beauty in order to do that, in order to account for the many different strata without getting lost. Because within the eidetic sphere, ascension looks exactly the same as descension. It's very easy to confuse deduction with induction, and it's very hard to keep track of just which step of the reduction you're on, whether it is you are suspending your personal beliefs, or the socially conditioned beliefs, or the natural sciences assumptions about existence and internalized views and externalized views. So it gets very confusing.
I liked when you were like, you lay out Husserl's what I take to be sort of like grand and like really complicated, you know, complex demands, and then it's like, so if we just modestly, you know, like, okay, yeah, very modest Husserl.
Modest Husserl. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
The infinite science of phenomenology.
And I think where that mistake and inability to actually perform those multiple reductions without losing track comes from his falling into the same trap that he accuses Descartes of falling into and Kant of falling into, that they have found the way. We finally, for the rest of time, have discovered the cockatoo and how it relates to the world. He has his phenomenological method, and finally, we can complete the transcendental project. There's nowhere else we need to go. We have this method, and there's no need for anything else. So I was like, Husserl, come on. You just fell for the same trap you accused everybody else of falling into. But so goes grand philosophy. Here. Oh. Right. Anybody else?
Right. Good
Okay.
evening. Yes, Angela.
Okay. Just a quick question. At the beginning, you talked about unhealthiness and being holistic, and I was wondering if you could develop more how that is related with authenticity, because I found it interesting. So.
Well, Husserl is following this ancient eudaimonia tradition where in order to become whole, humans need to satisfy all of their needs, not just the physical ones, but the intellectual ones as well. And we want to ensure that our body of knowledge is fulfilling that need, that we are actually knowing, whatever that means. The scientific endeavor is supposed to serve that intellectual need. We're supposed to become whole through it. And whenever our physical needs are met and our intellectual needs are met, and we can properly relate our body of knowledge to our world of experience, then we can say that we have a rational body of knowledge, that our behavior and motivations are rational, that we are complete beings, or at least beings coming to completion. So Husserl is saying that science as it's practiced today, or at least in Husserl's time, and I would often agree that still today, that science is not fulfilling that need because it already believes its method to be complete, that we no longer need to question that method and whether it or not it is successfully uniting what it is that we know to our realm of experience. There's this disconnect between, you know, what we know, which is, according to Husserl, predicated upon these abstract logical conceptions and our very direct lived experience. So he wants us to bring that body of knowledge back down to earth again, so to speak, and in that way complete that endeavor set out by the Greeks to be complete and have a rational foundation for our body of knowledge and our motivations and belief systems and society, if we can all participate in that scientific process. I don't know.
All right. Yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested in the way you present Husserl's like critique of natural sciences or the natural science, if I got you right. No? I'd like to raise three questions here. I want to get somehow I'd like to I'd like to know further, maybe Husserl's idea of the body. What does he mean by the body, and its like distinction or difference from what he said about the flesh. I think the body and the flesh were like concepts in phenomenology that Husserl or even Heidegger and the rest will keep on using or making some distinctions. No? So my understanding of the body is like, you know, the biological, the physical body. I don't know if that is the same with Husserl, and that of that distinction from the idea of the flesh. Or the second one is we all know that I think Husserl was so critical about the natural sciences. That's why he was able to like kind of introduce a different method, or say a rigorous discovery of man, no, by introducing phenomenology. Does it actually mean that Husserl in a way does not believe that natural sciences has the privilege to access the essences, no? Has no privilege to access the essences? That's the second question. My third question has to do with, you mentioned the idea of universalizing essences. I'm not sure what does it really mean, or of universalizing essences, because if you try to like, again, if I got you right, if you try to propose like science, natural science to be phenomenological, well, of course, it follows that it should have the capacity to access what they call the essences. But does it not also contradict the very nature of natural science, that it does not universalize knowledge, because science more like very specific, particular when it comes to providing knowledge, like it's always tentative. It does not provide certainty on certain discovery. So those are the three things that I want to share.
Just small questions. Well, regarding the body and the flesh, Husserl would claim that the natural sciences reduce the body, all bodies, all entities, phenomena of experiences, maybe not number, but any physical body to something material, to a natural body which is subject to the laws of time and space, subject to a certain sort of natural causality. Whereas the lived body, the body which we experience, is something animated. We embody beliefs. We are determined by motivations which cannot be reduced to material causes in terms of cause and effect. So we need to be able to account for those other motivations, to be able to account for the whole body as its experience, if we are to be empirical scientists. So it would contradict our experience of our own bodies to just reduce it to a slab of meat, a slab of flesh. It's animated by more than just electromagnetism and gravity and the likes. There's something more involved, something transcendental. Consciousness is intentional, and that sort of telos is also determining our actions and allowing us to step back and take notes and engage in science in the first place. So that would be the difference between body and mere material flesh, or the lived body. as far as the natural sciences to access essences, Husserl will say that we need the natural attitude in order to access those essences, because we are always experiencing this world through our body. So even while I'm sitting here reflecting and accessing this realm of essences, while I'm within the phenomenological attitude, I'm still breathing, my heart is still pumping, I'm still feeling things, I'm still taking in this sense data. And what Husserl wants to do is in real time observe how it is we're taking that in and relating to the sense world, while having that experience synthesized with past experiences, synthesized with essences, and how ideas and concepts arise out of that and are applied and removed and what have you. So the natural sciences get in the way whenever they don't allow for transcendental reflection in their method. Which leads into your next question. Is there room for essences in the natural sciences? Doesn't that contradict its endeavor to think that we're going to be able to account for things which we cannot see with microscopes and rulers and other tools of the natural sciences? I think Husserl would respond with, if by natural science we mean empirical science, well, we can certainly observe and experience these essences. We have to do so with our mind's eye, so to speak. We can't point to them physically, but so long as a natural science broadens its definition of what an entity of experience is, then essences don't necessarily contradict their practice. They just have to be open to different means and modes of measuring. I don't know if that satisfies your question or your burning, or if anyone believes that. Heidegger and Sartre certainly have their concerns. So maybe we can go on to these other presentations if there are no more questions. Although I could sit here and talk about Husserl all day. Are we good? I believe Angela Heredia, you are next.
Yes.
Heidegger presentation. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, I'm gonna share. I did a presentation. Could you able me to share the presentation? It says that you have to give me permission.
Oh, I think I have to make you a host. Let me do that. Oh dear. One moment. Oh, if I click on participants, maybe that's what. Make host. Yes.
Okay.
Yay.
No, thank you. Wait. Okay. Can you see it? Yes? Okay. So I'm gonna talk about Heidegger and authenticity. I'm gonna focus mainly on being and time. So in his earlier work, not on his later work. So in a nutshell, authenticity can be defined as assuming and appropriating our own possibilities of being. This is a meaning that Heidegger takes throughout mean and time, and he develops in different ways. And I put here a quote that of Heidegger, and he says, because Dasein is in each case essentially its own possibility, it can, in its very being, choose itself and win itself. It can also lose itself and never win itself, or only seem to do so, but only insofar as it is essentially something which can be authentic, that is, something of its own. Can it have lost itself and not yet won itself? So in here we find many things of what Heidegger means by authenticity, and I'm gonna try to untangle it through the presentation. But before that, I think it's important to clarify two things about Heidegger's ideas in being and time, and it's what is phenomenology for him, what is he trying to do, and the second is his notion of Dasein. Then I'm gonna give you a deeper overview of what is authenticity, particularly in relation to death and historicity. And then if you have time, I will give you some critiques done by decolonial authors like Fanon and Maldonado Torres, and also Levinas on this notion. So, so for Heidegger, he takes as a point of departure Husserl, but sort of reworks the definition of phenomenology. And for Heidegger, phenomenology joins both ontology and hermeneutics. Why? Because phenomenology is an exploration of what it means for things to be, or of how they show themselves to us and how they become meaningful. So in his words, and this is a quote of Being and Time, to let that which shows itself be seen from itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself. This is the formal meaning of that branch of research which calls itself phenomenology. So, but to understand this meaning of phenomenology, we have to take into account that meaning or meaningfulness for Heidegger is placed in our everydayness and our everyday practical and embodied engagement with the world. This means that in our everydayness, we are not internally reflecting about things, but practically engaging. And in that practical engaging, things come to have a meaning. So for Heidegger, consciousness is not placed internally by inwardly reflecting about things, but outwardly in this practical and embodied engagement. So with this, Heidegger aims to challenge the primacy of the rational conscious subject for understanding meaning, and also the subject-object division. So with this in our mind, Heidegger says that beings do not appear to us in a neutral space, but they always appear in a horizon of intelligibility, which is what he calls our understanding of being. And in this understanding of being as being the background of every meaning, of our shared meanings, things come to be meaningful. For this reason, for Heidegger, phenomenology is linked with ontology. This background is never fully explicit to us, even for the phenomenologist, is never explicit or fully understandable. So this horizon is not a representation, is not an internal conception of what being is, but is precisely the way we articulate meaning in this practical and embodied way. So there we find, for me, it's a very interesting idea of what meaning is, because meaning comes in the way things are in our practical engagement. So it's not our ideas, but it's still meaning. So that for me is very interesting. So this horizon of intelligibility is shared, and we are situated within this specific way of articulating meaning. And this is what he calls being in the world. So phenomenology allows this understanding of being to show itself by interpreting it. And this means that phenomenology is linked also to hermeneutics. So by being linked with hermeneutics, phenomenology renounces any possibility of fully making explicit this understanding of being. And it also implies that phenomenology is always situated within that understanding. So it's always done from within, and that makes phenomenology always a failed endeavor. And this is what he calls the hermeneutic circle. So, okay. And for Heidegger, the main point of departure for phenomenology is understanding the way human beings are. So the way what he called Dasein is. Okay, what defines its being as human? I think I interpret it like that. I know that not everyone does that, but yes. So it's a notion that targets the everyday mode of human existence. And this everyday mode of human existence means that we are not any particular essence, any particular characteristic, but we are always an unsettled way of being. This means that we always need to self-interpret ourselves and give meaning to ourselves. So this is what he refers to as existence is always prior to essence. Yeah, so we are always ecstatically oriented. This means that we're always projecting into our future and always projecting into the things we are engaged with. So we're always sort of other than ourselves. And this is related to Dasein. Being there means being outwardly, being there, being thrown at something or being projecting towards something. So for Heidegger, there is not a settled way of being Dasein, as its being emerges through this constant self-interpretation of itself and the world in which it is embedded, which becomes familiar and orients our everyday mode of being. So this means that the being of Dasein is always unsettled. For Dasein, its being is always at issue, he says. It constantly makes sense of itself and its own being. And this openness is given by Heidegger by temporality. So it's our being is open by what is coming, so the future, what has been and in which I am thrown, and what I'm dealing with now, which is in the situation in which I'm falling, in which I have fallen. These are the three modes in which we orient ourselves in the world and in which we are embedded. Yes, so, and here I have a quote. So he says, Dasein is an entity which does not occur among other entities. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. So this openness and unsettledness is going to be very important to understand what he means by authenticity. So throughout being and time, there are two ways of understanding authenticity, and they are sort of in tension and conflicting sort of between each other. One is normative and another is sort of descriptive. So in a descriptive way, Heidegger refers to authenticity as this irreducible individual character of existence. So the fact that the existence is always mine and is not transferable to anyone else. So my situation and the way I'm situated in the world and the possibilities in which I'm projected are always mine. And on the other hand, a normative sense of authenticity means for Heidegger that this mineness is also a desirable way of life in which I own my own situation, in which I own this openness in which that defines my way of being. So in a descriptive way, in the descriptive notion of authenticity, Heidegger says that there are three ways of relating to this inescapable particularity and openness of existence. By living or by existing authentically, indifferently, or inauthentically. And what changes between these three modes of existence is the degree to which a public interpretation of being takes up the task of self-interpretation. Heidegger calls this public interpretation the day, or das Man, and he says that this public interpretation in our everydayness takes up the role of interpreting and presents this interpretation as something that is fixed. So it sort of covers up the fact that we need this constant exercise of interpretation. So he says, mindness belongs to any existent Dasein, and belongs to it as the condition which makes authenticity and inauthenticity possible. In each case, Dasein exists in one or the other of these two modes, or else it is morally undifferentiated. So it is important to say that these three modes belong to the everydayness of Dasein's being. What happens is that this descriptive notion is mixed with his normative sense. So he thinks that living authentically is the desirable way of living. Okay. So authenticity then is the owning to such unsettledness of our being, facing up existence as our mode of being, as a constant mode of self-interpretation. And authenticity requires resoluteness and forerunning. Resoluteness refers to being sensitive to what my situation demands, or resolutely define the projects of my existence. Define which are the possibilities I'm facing and to which I can project and sort of self-interpret myself in a way that I fulfill those possibilities. And the second requirement for authenticity is forerunning. So forerunning is how I take my own situation and possibilities and my own in all their finitude, and I attempt to fulfill them or to assume them. So this means that authenticity for Heidegger is not finding a true nature through introspection, but the truth of existence is an ongoing process of dealing with our own open existence. And for Heidegger, this is revealed in three states, in anxiety, guilt, or death. These states show that existence is mine, particular, even if it is usually ruled by a public interpretation. For example, in anxiety, our familiarity crumbles and reveals the need to own our own existence. Or in guilt, we find ourselves, we realize that we are responsible for ourselves and the owning of our own possibilities. And the other one is death. And this one I'm gonna go a little bit more into depth. So for Heidegger, death is linked to authenticity because it allows Dasein to realize that its existence is its own. So it reveals to Dasein the particularity of its existence. So for Heidegger, death is the loss of all possibilities, or what he says is the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. So when this loss of all possibilities is faced by Dasein, it exposes the unsettledness and instability of its being. It makes Dasein face the inescapability and uniqueness of its situation. And it makes Dasein realize that this loss of all possibilities is a permanent possibility that is covered up by the public interpretation of being. So what happens in the everydayness is that death is presented as something that happens, but something that happens to in a distant temporality and in a distant space, in a way that I don't see it as my own possibility. So just in the moment when I face that the loss of possibility is actually a permanent thing that can happen, then I realize that my existence is my own and that I have to own to my possibilities. Okay, and here I have a quote by Heidegger. So he says, holding death for true, death is just one's own, shows another kind of certainty and is more primordial than any certainty which relates to entities encountered within the world or to formal objects, for it is certain of being in the world. As such, holding death for truth does not demand just one definite kind of behavior in the sign, but demands the sign itself in the full authenticity of its existence. And this relation between death and authenticity is linked to how temporality opens the sign's existence. So, future-oriented anticipation is linked with the projection of death as an ultimate possibility. Authenticity is linked to future-oriented openness and to anticipation of of the loss of all possibilities. But there is also an inauthentic way of temporalizing for Heidegger, and is related to prioritizing the present and prioritizing how things are usually dealt with and interpreted, and think that that way is fixed and is the way things are. Yeah. And finally, authenticity is linked with historicity, because for Heidegger, authenticity involves not only owning one's own possibilities of projection, but also owning one's own past. So authenticity is linked with history and the past, because it needs a retake and appropriation of tradition, of the socio-cultural context in which we are thrown, in which we orient ourselves. So this leads him to take a communal take on authenticity, and this is very problematic. I will tell you why. So a community can authentically assume a shared destiny and assume its own possibilities of being as a destiny for Heidegger. So yes, so this means that it's not simply unlinking from the situation in which I'm thrown, but assuming it and owning its possibilities. So authenticity is not breaking free from this way in which I'm thrown in a context and in a social-cultural world, but assuming the possibilities that come from that context and creatively appropriating them as my own. So being authentically free is recognize that I'm a finite being with a shared past and creatively appropriating it. So I chose just 3 critiques, mainly from a philosopher called Nelson Maldonado Torres, Fanon, and Levinas. And I think the 3 have similar points. The first point is the link between authenticity and Narcissism. The possibility of communal authenticity requires resoluteness at a collective level through the work of a leader. And many commentators said that this is precisely linked to Heidegger's support of Nazism during his life. And what more dangerously links this to death is the importance of war for realizing one's community destiny, which is problematic, of course. And this is why, for example, Levinas says that his ontology, because it puts into the center precisely ontology and not ethics, is complicit with violence. And more related to the colonial point of view, for example, Fanon says that death is the permanent horizon of intelligibility for colonized, oppressed, and racialized people. So it's not something extraordinary. So saying that you accomplish authenticity by facing the possibility of death for the colonized or the racialized is nonsense, which shows that precisely that sign refers to a specific way of being human and not this universalizing way of understanding the human that I think Heidegger falls into. Yeah, so this is my presentation. I don't know if you have questions. Sorry because of my English.
Oh no, that was great! Yay! Thank you, thank you. I think what I find interesting about the universalizing factor of death is, you know, what that has to do with our universal concepts and stuff. Taking it back to Husserl, you know, the source of our logical concepts and how it is we apply them. Whereas Husserl starts at the present and leads in with a little bit of memory. You know, we have Heidegger dealing with death, and in one sense, one might think, well, hey, death would lead to quite the empty universal there. It's the absolute nothing. But I can see how in the face of death, true character might come out, or all the feelings that we have bottled up, or all the concerns that we don't usually deal with and push aside because we have to be productive, come out and to the fore. And in that sense, that life is the substance of our universality, and maybe just death is the formal stage upon which that life can dance, at least not while we're succumbing death, because then we've found an end, but in the face of it at least. So I don't know, what are any thoughts on how it is universal concepts can rise formally out of death, and how life can fill that formality of death in its wake? Yeah.
So why death could bring out sort of universal concept? That's what you're asking, or?
Yeah, like how can this grand nothingness be the formal structures which occasion your true character to come out, and qualities and the content of your life?
And you mean for Heidegger, or
yeah.
what I think of that? Ah, okay. So yeah, because he says that death, when I face death, I realize that the existence is my own. Why? Because I cannot transfer death. I cannot die for the other, or the other cannot die for me. So in this moment in which I realize that death is just my own possibility, and it can't just be my own, then I realize that existence is mine. But I don't find anywhere how he justifies that this is a universal, is the way that every design, every human experiences this. But I think this is related, of course, with the hermeneutic circle. Why? Because his point of departure is his situatedness, and this is sort of his blind spot, and he's trying to interpret Dasein's existence from this situatedness. So yeah, so I don't think it can.
So
I'm
concepts, oh, sorry.
this is something I'm actually a little bit more sympathetic, I think, with Heidegger on, because I think you're right that he doesn't justify it, but I think also there's a possibility in Heidegger that people don't recognize this. Like, you could, I think, in theory, live your life not facing, in the way Heidegger means, oh, like, I'm gonna die. But I think obviously the point that under colonialism and other forms of oppression, this is Sartre's point about the living under Nazi occupation, or Camus in The Plague or something like that, that you are faced like really eminently with this possibility, and so it becomes more difficult to avoid, because the they self is structured in Heidegger to make it so that we don't face it. Idle chatter and all of that distracts us from this possibility of death, in a way. But I do think Heidegger is kind of right here about, my death is mine, and that's one of the things that individualizes me, because it's my own, and no one, I can jump in front of a bullet for somebody, but that just means that I died my death there, and their death is just postponed. It's just pushed back a little bit, but it's still like waiting out there somewhere. So yeah, I think I'm sort of sympathetic to that idea of like that universalizing horizon wherein it's mine and it delimits me as an individual. But I also agree too, like with the spirit of the criticism that, yeah, but some people really have to face that. It's like thrown in their face by their oppression. And Heidegger was, he had a kind of a rough experience during the war. His house was occupied. His sons were in Russian prisoner of war camps for like, one of them was in for like 9 years or something like that. So it wasn't like all peachy, but he was relatively comfortable most of the time.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but I think there, for example, Fanon has a point, and is that for example, for the racialized, how do I explain this? Death is not a matter of my individuality, but it's a matter of it becomes sort of like my destiny, and it becomes so quotidian and so part of my possibilities that it's not individualizing. It's just part of what we are as a community. So I think I agree there with Fanon that this shows that Heidegger is coming from a particular experience of the human in which life is sort of safe and sacralized, and it cannot explain the underside of this modern notion of the human.
All right. Thank you. I have also some few questions to ask. And one thing that I actually wrote here, the first question actually has to do with the idea of inauthenticity. Is being inauthentic a bad thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, I'm not sure what Heidegger would say about it, whether inauthenticity is something that we should overcome, or is it part of our natural everydayness, our everydayness activity or whatsoever. So that's the first question that I'd like to raise. The second is you mentioned about the indifference in authenticity, and indifference. Is indifference entirely a different kind of mode of being that cannot be reduced to either authenticity or inauthenticity or authenticity? third one is I'm interested in the, I think you, on the last slide, you mentioned about collective authenticity. Like, is it possible to really have what we call a collective authenticity when authenticity is a what we call a individual, maybe an individual personal project? Kind of like, in what sense can we more or less able to achieve collective authenticity?
Okay, so the first one, I think Heidegger conflicts between both perspectives that you told. So on one hand, he says that living inauthentically by escaping my possibilities through always assuming the public interpretation of being is part of our everydayness, and it's something that we sort of cannot escape. But I think he also considered that this is something that we should aspire to distance from, and that's why for him authenticity is it's almost like a value. It's something that we should, it's something that is desirable. So I think he conflicts between both, and even when he's trying to give just a descriptive account of our everydayness, he already uses terms that makes us think that this inauthenticity is something bad or something undesirable. So I think there is tension there. Regarding indifference, I'm not that sure, but I think it's irreducible to both. It's sort of like it's not assuming that our interpretation of being is completely fixed and it's completely determined by third, by the outside, by the public interpretation, nor is owning authentically my possibilities through my own projects. So it's in the everydayness, we sort of, I think for Heidegger, we do both all the time. We do both all the time. The extremes are sort of like poles of desirability and undesirability for him, I think. And regarding the third one, well, I'm not that sure. I think it's not like it's a tension there, and mainly because he refers to collective authenticity regarding historicity. So he does not talk about that when he explains authenticity and mindness, but just when he talks about historicity. So I don't think that it's like a possibility that is completely, how do you say that, able to be fulfilled, but it's something that it comes out in extreme situations where a community is completely lost in authenticity. So yeah.
All right. Any more questions for our presenter?
Can we stop the screen share and kick the host back to Kelly? Awesome, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Angela. That was great. I really appreciate your presentation. Moving along, we go to Donovan Irven with some Sartre.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of talk us through Sartre's idea of authenticity, which draws very heavily on both Husserl and Heidegger, of course. Most of what I'm going to talk about comes from being and nothingness, although I'm going to, I think, discuss a slightly later example that he uses in a text from 1946 that was published posthumously called Truth and Existence. I'm also going to talk about Beauvoir, because you can't talk about Sartre without talking about Beauvoir. When I was taught existentialism, of course, it was like Jean-Paul Sartre, and Beauvoir was like his girlfriend. And of course, that's nonsense. You don't get Sartre without Beauvoir. Beauvoir is as equally as important, I think, as Sartre. So I'll be saying some things about her as well. But so Sartre is critical of the idea of the transcendental ego, as we know, because you cannot get a non-sort of particularized consciousness. Each consciousness is conscious of what it is not. So he agrees with Husserl that consciousness has an intentional structure, that it's conscious of objects and things in the world, but that means that the fundamental thing that it is conscious of is not itself. So this is why he says really cool stuff like nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm, you know, and that, because there's this fundamental negation that establishes consciousness in relation to the object. And even when I want to become self-conscious, I become conscious of myself as an object. So I become conscious of myself exactly as I'm not. I become conscious of this like self-image that I've projected of myself, conscious of myself as a teacher, a husband or father, as the waiter in the cafe, or whatever the case may be. So what we begin to see then is my being is bouncing back and forth between two different modalities, the pour soi and the en soi. This is the for itself and the in itself. So the for itself, maybe I should do the in itself first, because that's a little more straightforward. The in itself is just things in itself, things that are determined in their being, they're full of being, they can't really become anything else on their own. We could act on them and transform a piece of wood into a chair, but the piece of wood is not just going to transform into a chair. It is what it is, so to speak. Now, we do sort of exist in this mode because we're bodies. I think this resonates with the Husserl bit, right? We're subject to laws of physics, to our metabolism. We have to eat and sleep and all that kind of stuff. We age and we go through puberty and things happen to our body. If you cut us, we'll bleed, that kind of stuff. We'll fall down the hill if we trip. So we live in itself in part. We didn't choose where we're born. We don't choose our parents, our language, our socioeconomic background. We're thrown into existence. That resonates with the Heidegger bit. But once we're here, we have to choose. And that's where the for itself comes in. The for itself is, well, my existence for myself. I'm self-interested and concerned with my future. I make plans, I make projects, I have hopes and dreams and desires. There's things about my past that even though I can't change them, I maybe don't like them, and I want to work to overcome them or to hide them or to all of that kind of stuff. So this is really where freedom gets very heavily emphasized for Sartre. You know, he has this famous, we're condemned to be free. I can't choose not to choose. If I say, oh, I'm not going to choose, well, yeah, that's cool, but that's a choice. Right? You've just chosen not to choose. Or actually what you've done more often is you've let somebody else choose for you, and you just did what they said, or you followed along with the crowd or something like that. So these two things, though, are kind of at tension with one another, right? It's hard for me to reconcile myself to the fact that once I do make a decision, that decision is going to take on all the objectivity of something in the past. I can't undo it. I can't go back and change it. It's done. And it sinks into the past just like other objects that I experience. That's like really hard for people to deal with. It's hard for me sometimes. You know, you are faced with a decision, like what school am I going to go to? Even like silly stuff, like what am I going to eat for dinner tonight? Once you pick spaghetti over hamburger, that's it. It's spaghetti for that night for all time. And there's no going back and like not eating the spaghetti after you've done it or whatever. It's kind of a trivial example, but you can see why if you build it up with bigger decisions, it becomes like really anxiety inducing, because you now have to live having done that forever with no going back. So one of the key things, I think this was our inroad to authenticity. Authenticity demands that we have to find a way to balance between we have to be able to move between our being in itself and our being for itself. We have to be able to reconcile ourselves to our past and to like live with the choices that we've made, while also like owning the decisions that we've made moving into the future. So again, you can see shades of Heidegger here. You can see that it's historical, that we have to, but Sartre escapes the problem. There's no like communal authenticity as much in Sartre, because the with others is not constitutive of the self for him. For Heidegger, my being with others is constitutive of my Dasein, but for Sartre, I have to recognize the existence of others, but their existence does not constitute me in my being in this way. So I don't know. That might make it better or worse in some ways. Some people would say that makes it a little tough, because that means I live in a very adversarial relationship with other people, that we're having to like negotiate our freedom. And sometimes when I enact my freedom, it compromises yours and vice versa. So there's always this element of like struggle in Sartre. So that's something we could talk about afterwards. It might be interesting. So because authenticity can be scary like this, and we have to face these choices and take ownership and responsibility for these things, we can't escape our responsibility. We're stuck with it. We're like infinitely responsible. Sartre shoots back, you know, some people say, they'll echo Dostoevsky from the Brothers Karamazov. They'll say, well, if God is dead, you know, everything's permissible, the gloves are off. Sartre is like, no, that's the other way, because if God's dead, now you're totally and completely responsible for everything. There's no one that will save you. No God will come and save you. Nothing will come and validate your choices and justify what you've done. It's all on you totally, which is even more like heavy and paralyzing for people. So even though it's impossible to escape this responsibility, we're ontologically like stuck with it. It's part of our very being. People want to do it all the time. They're constantly trying to. And this leads to bad faith, which is one of the most, I think, influential and significant concepts that come out of being and nothingness. I actually think, though, Beauvoir is more useful to talk about bad faith. So here's where I'm going to jump ship from Sartre for a second and talk about Beauvoir. So what Beauvoir is very good at sketching out these different kinds of psychological profiles for how people try to flee from their responsibility and try to flee from their freedom. Now, again, just to repeat, it's not possible to actually accomplish that. You're really stuck with it, but it's scary and like you don't want to deal with it. And so you will play all these psychological games with yourself. I think one of the most useful games that people play, useful for us, for understanding people, and you see this all the time in the world, is what Beauvoir calls seriousness. So the serious person, they've made a choice, they've joined a church, or they've joined a political party, or they've chosen a career or whatever. But then they attempt to disavow that choice by saying that the thing they're doing has an absolute and transcendental value independent of their choice. So it's like, well, I chose, but like, what else was I really going to do? This is like baked into the fabric of reality as like an absolute value for me. So like, yeah, I chose it, but I didn't like really have a choice because it's just like true with a capital T, or because God told me to, or because the party, you know, that's what the Democrats or the Republicans say, or whatever the case may be. So Beauvoir says that this is the spirit of seriousness. You take your own personal value that you've chosen, and then you project it as a transcendental absolute. And you claim then that, well, you didn't really have a choice, right? It's insane to rebel against nature or to the structure of reality or something like that. Now, the problem with the seriousness for Beauvoir, and all of this is in the Ethics of Ambiguity, that it's easily disappointed because the world won't live up to the value that you demand of it, as people are failing you, the party doesn't succeed, or if you're religion and you're there praying, the voice doesn't come and God doesn't confirm to you and all that kind of stuff. So seriousness is kind of a risk because it could be disappointed. And the serious person will often lapse into nihilism. Nihilism, Beauvoir says, is a disappointed seriousness whose choice of value has not been confirmed by the world, and so they throw themselves into like negation. Then nothing matters. If this isn't true, if this isn't confirmed in me, if it's not justifying my choices, then screw it, basically, and so on. So the trick for existential authenticity, getting back a little bit more to Sartre, but I think Beauvoir also holds this, is finding a way to sort of like soberly face your choice and to recognize that there's not going to be some extraordinary justification for what you're doing. Other people will affirm your choice, but you're really the only one that can justify it. Like, other people can be like, yeah, you're doing a good job, congratulations. But you're the one who still has to keep doing the job and wake up every morning and brush your teeth and go to work or go to school or work at whatever it is that you're doing, in a way. So you have to be able to live without the kind of pat on the back that would come from some sort of external justification, while still committing yourself to it and finding that value within yourself to like get up in the morning and keep doing it. And that's like the trick to existential authenticity. The real bind that I think Sartre and Beauvoir find themselves in is, and they admit this, they're very happy to acknowledge this, people live their life as if the thing they chose to do and the value that they've chosen is an absolute value. That's why it has weight. That's why you get up and like live your life doing that thing, because it has this absolute value to you. But you also have to like recognize that it's not like a real absolute, that it doesn't have this transcendental weight beyond your having chosen it. So you have to play this weird game where on the one hand, you have thrown yourself into it and you've committed it. It has become an absolute value to you, while still sort of acknowledging like, yeah, but it's not like a capital A absolute value outside of history or human context or anything like that. So I think also, like Husserl, this idea of like harmony and balancing between the facticity of your existence, the situation that you find yourself in, and the freedom that throws you beyond that situation into a future that's undisclosed to you is really key to authenticity as you find it in Sartre or in Beauvoir. It's not like a very easy thing. I think, you know, people oftentimes want to say like, well, the existentialists say life is meaningless then. Okay, that's kind of true in one sense. If what you're demanding is that transcendental absolute that exists beyond human history and beyond our own projects, yeah, okay, that we don't have that, that's meaningless. But we're constantly generating meaning through our choices and our commitment to these projects. And so life is really eminently meaningful in that way. You like can't do anything without generating meaning because it's always future looking. It's always in order to do something or achieve this or do that. So in that sense, life is like really deeply meaningful. And the trick for Beauvoir and Sartre is to try to explain, why do I then commit myself? Like for what reason will I commit myself? And Sartre is very famous for being like, well, I can't tell you that. That's like the whole point. He tells this story in the Existentialism is a Humanism of someone who came to him to ask advice. My mother is home at sick. I should be taking care of her. I have these responsibilities to my family. But I should also be going off to fight this war. There's this political calling and I'm like stuck. I think these are two very, important causes. I need to commit myself to something, what should I do? And Sartre is like, well, I can't tell you which one of those is like important. And in fact, in a way, you already know because you chose to come and talk to me. And you know me as a person and you like kind of have an idea of what I'm going to say. So the fact that you came to ask me and not anybody else shows me that like you already have some idea of what you're going to do anyway. Because if you wanted to go fight war, you could have gone off to talk to like the recruitment officer or your veteran uncle or something like that, and they value war. That's part of their value system or whatever. They value being a soldier, maybe not value war, value being a soldier. They would have said, yeah, go off and fight the war. Versus if you would have talked to your best friend who's like a nurse and who values caring for people, they would have, where their values lie is more toward, yeah, stay at home and take care of your mom. You know, so you came and talked to me for a reason, and I'm telling you, you're stuck with having to choose. I can't like determine for you which of those values is going to be the one to you. So yeah, we have on the one hand this facticity, the being in itself, our concrete situation that has been set up ahead of time by other people, mostly by our parents and family, and then the greater sort of community that we live in. We're thrown into that. We have to make choices about how to navigate with that, but the future opens up into possibilities that we have to navigate from on the basis of our freedom. And authenticity is really about that navigation, about being able to soberly assess and evaluate our situation and what it means for us, and make choices about that moving forward without trying to shirk off the responsibility through these like psychological games of bad faith that we play. I think Beauvoir is really good at sketching those psychological profiles. I think she does a really good job of that. Sartre is also pretty good at it. His novel, people don't like it as much. I don't think. I think I kind of like it because I like most of his novels. But in which one is it now? In The Age of Reason, he talks about a group of people living in like pre-war France, and they're all kind of like inauthentic. They really don't want to like have to own up to the things that they're doing. And I think that the reason why people don't like the novel is because they don't like to deal with these characters being all like, nah. They want someone to do something and like own up to it. And Sartre is just kind of like, yeah, but that's the point of the novel. So these people like kind of suck at that. They're not very good at it. So the novel is not as maybe as exciting as people want. But the whole point of it is to sketch out this group of people who are really failing to take ownership of what they want other people to decide. They want to go with the flow, follow Heidegger's they or something like that. And so it's you're always left with this like unsatisfying feeling of like, why won't you just like own it? It also gives you a chance to reflect a little bit on, well, maybe I do that. Maybe I do that like a lot. And I don't like to think about myself like doing that. What are the ways in which I shirk off my responsibility and want other people to decide? I always use it as an example. Again, it's a trivial example, but I think you can generalize it to more important things. If you've ever tried to decide with a group of people about where to go eat, and like nobody wants to be the one to be like, oh, we're going to this restaurant or whatever. And there's always this like, oh, I don't care, you decide. Yeah. That's a really good like low-key example of this kind of like bad faith where people just don't want to like step up and be like, yeah, go here. No, you decide. That you decide thing is very, very typical. This is why Sartre says really controversial things like under the Nazi occupation, Parisians were never more free, right? They were never more free than under the Nazi occupation. Why? Because the weight of their choices was very in front of them all the time. They realized how much responsibility rested on their shoulders. Now, of course, that's a very provocative statement, and Sartre's purposefully being inflammatory. But he really wants us to consider very seriously the fact that, well, I'm not actually ever free of that kind of burden. I don't always know like where my choices are going to lead me, especially sort of like bigger life choices and stuff like that. I sometimes like think or act as if it's not that big of a deal, but really this kind of weight of responsibility is always there, sort of like haunting me. I'm always being sort of followed by this weight of responsibility around, and people just don't want to deal with it most of the time. So, yeah, balance your for itself with your in itself and have a sober assessment of your situation and the possibilities that you can sketch out there. So I think that is the core ideas that you probably need to be equipped with to really get like what's going on with existential authenticity as Sartre and Beauvoir outline it. There are some interesting, I think, wrinkles that are less essential to just understanding the basic idea, like some of the post-colonial and decolonial thought that arises whenever Sartre gets into more conversation with Fanon and other thinkers there. But I'm going to leave it, I think, at that, and just at the sketch of what is authenticity, at least as it appears in Being and Nothingness and the Ethics of Ambiguity.
Hey, thank you, Donovan.
No problem.
I'm so glad that you went to de Beauvoir to talk about bad faith, because as a woman and a waitress, I cannot stand the examples that Sartre uses to go over that, to the point where I just don't even want to read it. And I associate often his philosophy with people who just rationalize their bad behavior. Well, I was free to do whatever I want. I don't have a commitment to others, and this, that, and the other. But I think you did a wonderful job of being charitable and painting that in a way that even I could get down with Sartre's views there.
There's an interesting, so in the French and in the new, and in Sarah's Richmond's new translation of Being and Nothingness, Hazel Barnes inserts the word consent into the encounter between the woman and her date. That makes it read a lot differently than it does in French and in this new translation. Because of course the problem that the woman is facing in that date situation is exactly whether or not to consent. And she's really, I think, what Sartre is trying to get across there, which I agree that those examples are not always the best ones. But I think what he's attempting to get across is, like, at a certain level, this woman really just wants to enjoy the evening. Like, she wants to have like a nice dinner out. And she knows that this guy's like trying to get something from her. And maybe he's like not a creep or something like that, but she also doesn't want to like deal with it right then, you know? So that's my very generous reading. And I do think in the new translation and in the French, it reads a little bit different when consent comes up a little later in the example. Whereas when you read it in Hazel Barnes's translation, it's almost like, oh, and she's just consented, like right off the bat. It's like, no, that's the problem. That's the whole issue, is whether or not to consent. I mean, that's the deal. So anyway, I don't strongly disagree with you about the issues in those examples in Being and Nothingness.
Like, she just didn't want to hold your sweaty, pasty, nasty hand. Okay.
Yeah. But notice though how there is that play between the in itself and the for itself. Sometimes taking myself just as the object, sometimes reveling in my freedom and my, in my subjectivity, because you can't enjoy dinner if you're not a subject, right? So there's always this weird oscillation between my being as an object in itself and my being as this freedom for itself. But I'm never going to resolve that. I'm never going to fully, this is what he says, I'll never fully coincide with my being. I'll never be simply an object in coincidence with myself. There will always be this distance. I'll always be a little bit ahead of myself as I look into the future, and behind as I drag my past like along with me. He calls it the decompression of being. There's this split or this difference written into my existence.
I like that split. I think that's where the magic of interpretation can happen. It just spontaneity, and life can speak to you in those cracks.
Yeah. This is Beauvoir's whole thing of ambiguity is there. That it's my existence is ambiguous. I'm an object, but I'm also the subject, and I can't erase that. I can't just lapse into one side or the other. That's what she thinks is the problem with a lot of things in the history of philosophy, is that it chooses one, or it reduces to one side. And her mission in the ethics of ambiguity is to hold the ambiguity in place, to maintain the distinction without falling into one side or the other, in a way. I don't know if she pulls that off, but she makes a heck of a run at it.
Yeah, I like the attempt.
Yeah.
Questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you, Donovan, for your very, um, I think, interesting introduction to Sartre and de Beauvoir. I'm not, I'm not very familiar with Sartre nor Simone de Beauvoir, so I think I got a lot of interesting ideas from you. But while while listening to uh, your articulation of Sartre's authenticity, there was a for me. I kind of like there is. I feel like there is an extreme pessimism, or maybe like a pessimism in Sartre when it comes to the emphasis on individualism, the idea that we are our we choose by our own. We don't. There is no sense of blaming others for our actions. We own up all those things, and as if other or the others are not really responsible for the decisions I made, or they are not factor in to the choices that I have made, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I don't know if that is really one of the kind of what do you call this? Like a feeling that one can actually feel in while reading Sartre, the feeling of there is a element of pessimism in there when he extremely emphasized the individualism, owning one's own decisions, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing that I really was able to realize there, no, while listening to your sharing.
Yeah.
The other one, yeah, okay.
No, go ahead.
The other one is just a confirmation, or maybe a point of clarification. As I understood, authenticity requires. I mean, authenticity could mean being responsible, being responsible to one's own actions and decisions. Is that kind of like a condition for authenticity?
Yeah, I think that it's a necessary, but it doesn't do it by itself.
Okay.
Because I think for Sartre, at the end of the day, you cannot actually get away from your responsibility. So authenticity has more to do with like an attitude, or like a recognition of the responsibility. Because the responsibility is an ontological condition of your freedom for Sartre. So in reality, there's no actual way to like disburden yourself or escape your responsibility. But when you're being inauthentic or you're acting in bad faith, you're basically trying to like disavow it or like cover it up in some way. So I think authenticity has a lot to do with like recognizing and like taking up in an explicit way, like your it's kind of like it's like an attitude. I think an attitude or an orientation towards your own actions, where you're like, I am sort of doing this. I agree with you that especially in Being and Nothingness, it has a very strong individualism to it. I think Beauvoir is a good corrective to that, because she says that existentialism is an individualism because it asserts the absolute value of the individual. However, it recognizes that the individual can only live and become an individual and have meaning in the situation, in their social historical context. I think that Sartre agrees with that, but he doesn't emphasize it. It's a matter of like emphasis. Because Sartre does talk about the situation in Being and Nothingness, and that we emerge out of a historical trajectory we live in a world where we find values as if they're ready-made by other people. Our parents will tell us, hey, you should value this, get this job, you know, you need to get married, whatever, you know, the case may be. But then it comes down to us as an individual to make decisions about those values. So like, yeah, your parents can take you to church every Sunday growing up, but there's a certain point at which you have to decide, am I still going to go to church every Sunday, like now that I am on my own? But I do agree with you that the emphasis very much is on the individual. And Sartre becomes increasingly aware of this. So in his later work, when he's really engaging with Marxism and like the critique of dialectical reason, and in in his like huge study of Flaubert, he has like, it's like this huge 3-volume study of Flaubert. In English, it's 5 volumes actually, but he tries to show the dialectical movement between the individual and the historical collective, because he thinks that each individual lives as a singularity, but they also reflect like the totality of their times through their, it's the very Hegelian thing, like the totality, the whole is reflected in the particular, or something like that. So the reason why he does this huge study of Flaubert is to show how, as a singular individual who produced particular artworks, Flaubert is very, very idiosyncratic. He's doing his own individual thing on the one hand, but through that particularity, he reflects like the spirit of his age or the totality of his historical situation. And every individual does that as a product of their times, but that is responsible for their own choices. So each of us are like inflecting the history that we live in through our own particular like lens in a way. So it is a kind of radical individualism, but the individual can only exist and take on the meaning we do within the historical moment or whatever. I don't know if that's helpful, and that's not always satisfying for people. Some people are still like, yeah, Sartre.
Do you think maybe there has to be like the difference of emphasis between de Beauvoir and Sartre? Do you think that the Beauvoir analysis on gender has to do with that different way of approaching freedom and authenticity? Because I'm thinking about Fanon, and the difference in emphasis is
Yeah.
Similar, sort of. So I don't know. How do you see de Beauvoir's analysis on gender playing a role in having a different perspective on him? Because I hate when we conflate them both and then they become this
I think that
whole being. So yeah.
To be a little more critical of Sartre, I think that he's explaining consciousness from the position of the one. And Beauvoir's being like, hey, but wait a second though, like not all of our choices are like validated like that. We don't all just get to go around, you know, because in her analysis of the one and the other takes on the derivative value in relation to the one. The wife is supposed to play a supporting role to the husband and all of that kind of stuff. And that really compromises this freedom to just make decisions in the world freely, in a way. So I think that there's a couple of things that really shift Beauvoir's emphasis, and I think actually in a much better way than Sartre. And I think Sartre's position on this changes in relation to Beauvoir. Peg Simmons and Kate Kirkpatrick particularly have been making, I think, very strong arguments that Beauvoir like basically changes Sartre's interpretation of freedom, and that he's like taking up a lot of her ideas after ethics of ambiguity and the second sex and that kind of thing. So I think that Beauvoir, for one, is much more interested early on in ethics, which is an important emphasis. And Sartre's trying to play like the great man of philosophy, systematizing this like ontology thing. And that definitely gives his, especially being a nothingness, like the flavor that it has of this like abstract, you know, indifferent structure of consciousness and all of that. And Beauvoir's kind of over there giving him the side eye, like, now wait a minute, buddy. if we're really all situated in the way that you're saying that we are, is it really the case that we all have this like universal structure and all of this kind of stuff that we can navigate our freedom in this way? Well, no, because we're in the particular situation. And there's where like the second sex derives its like power, I think. So the second sex is probably, I would put the second sex on a short list as being one of the most important works of philosophy in the 20th century, I think. I think it's probably the most influential book of existentialism, more influential than Being and Nothingness, actually, in its like reach, in a way. So, yeah, I think that Beauvoir and Fanon are almost like, they almost have to have that different perspective because of the situation, and their recognition of that makes their philosophy like actually a little better. And Sartre's just trying to do this like great systematizer thing, like in the spirit of Hegel and Kant and all that kind of stuff, which, as like you said, Kelly, about Husserl, leads him into some of those same traps of universalizing like a very particular kind of human existence as being like the one abstract absolute, when his own philosophy at the end of the day doesn't support him doing that. Even if you take seriously some of the things that he says, it's like, yeah, but you can't then turn around and do that. You can't make the move given the foundation that you laid out about appearances and all this kind of stuff. So anyway.
It's such a tempting move to make.
Yeah, we all want, I mean, I'm guilty of that. I want that sometimes, you know? I don't know. I was raised, you know, my education was very heavy in the history of philosophy. I read all of these, you know, Kant and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, sometimes I'm writing and I'm like, I want to make this claim. I'm like, oh yeah, this is how structure of consciousness, you know, it is. You know? And I have to like stop and be like, to get that little voice in my, I have to have the other speaking in my ear. Yeah, it's very tempting, very tempting. We're conditioned, I think, particularly, just speaking for myself, I think as white men, we're conditioned in a way to like talk that way. And so it's very easy to fall into that, like, because you've been socialized to do it. And people won't question you about it. They'll be like, oh yeah, good job, genius, brilliant, you know? Yeah, so it's tempting.
As someone who's on the usually reactionary end of things, admittedly, I fall into that, like, especially as a waitress. I'm like, no, excuse me, I'm going to tell you how it is, and this is how it is. Yeah. And that's the voice of the waitress. I'm going to tell it how it is. Oh, hold on. Maybe there's truth to that. I like to think there is, but I think it's good to have that other voice in your head going, hold on, as you said.
It's important for all of these people that we've talked about. I mean, they're asking us, if we're reading them all generously, they're asking us to like stop for a second and take a little distance from the world that we're like immediately immersed in and try to get like some like critical purchase on that, which a very simple thing to say, very difficult to like actually do, you know. That's why I like all of these thinkers. I'm into all of this because of like that basic move, which I've said in a really grossly oversimplified way, but I don't think is misrepresenting them.
No, I think you did a great job. Like I said, you even got me liking Sartre.
I don't know if that should be celebrated or not.
Great evils you have committed tonight.
I really like the books he writes. I'll say that.
Oh, yay! Thank you, Donovan.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me do this. This has been really good.
Ben, are you able to present on Marion this evening or morning for you? A little bit?
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here this morning. So I think I will represent another French philosopher. So it's a kind of a balance. So we have two German, and then we have two French. So I will represent Jean-Luc Marion as a philosopher. But what I'm going to give you is a very kind of like a sketchy outline of Marion's ideas or thought. Because first, I don't find any kind of like an explicit discussion of Marion regarding authenticity, and nor kind of like a normative or descriptive discussion of Marion regarding authenticity. So that's kind of like a difficulty, on my part. But maybe what I'm going to do is simply present you kind of like his view on what they call the saturated phenomenon. He's famous for that concept of saturated phenomenon, through the understanding of the gift as a springboard to conclude my argument, saying that authenticity really for Marion is something that is undetermined. That's my own interpretation of his view, in a sense that for Marion, in one of his works, he would like to think that the question about authenticity is a question about knowing the self. But then he would say that there is no way for us to really know the self. There is kind of like an aporia or like a paradox. And the only way to do that is to overcome our understanding of what knowing is. So I'm not sure if you're able to somehow get the point, but I'll make it clear later on when I reach that point. Okay. So I'll start with Marion's intellectual history, or maybe the context where he's coming from as a French philosopher and phenomenologist. So I think he belonged to the second or third generation of phenomenologists in France. Okay, when we like started from the time of Levinas, and Sartre, and then followed by what we call the group of Marion and Michel Henry, and that of Chrétien and Lacoste. So these are kind of new, they call them new phenomenologists. Of course, Marion has, we can divide Marion's works into three divisions. He started with works on René Descartes. He's one of the famous French commentator on René Descartes, a Cartesian expert in France. And so one of those works that is famous is the Cartesian on Descartes' metaphysical prism, metaphysical prism, where he started to explain, or he started to present a view of, or a critique of reason of Descartes, when Marion argues that Descartes started to organize or form what they call the idea of reason as the only measure of knowledge. So there is what we call the order and measure of things. Whatever can be measured and whatever can be ordered is knowledge, or knowledge is knowing. So Marion later on would criticize that when he introduced his view of saturated phenomenon. The other works of Marion has to do with theology. I think in North America, Marion first gained the popularity because of his work on God without being. That was the first, I think that was the first translation in English, Marion's God without being. But there are other several theological works of Marion, where, for example, you have the Prolegomena to Charity, okay, and then the Idol and Distance. These are like theological work of Marion. And lastly, on phenomenology. So Marion in phenomenology, he has one magnum opus, or maybe kind of the three important works. First is the Reduction and Givenness. It's a survey of the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, and also kind of like a criticism of their phenomenology. Then followed by Marion's work, Being Given. So in Being Given, it is there when Marion fully developed the idea of phenomenology of givenness. Of course, this is not really Marion's concept of givenness came from Husserl. It started from Husserl and Heidegger. And then the summary of these two, the last work is called In Excess. So it's a compilation of articles or essays that responses to criticism, okay, criticism on Marion, based on his earlier works, The Reduction and Givenness, and that of Being Given. And lately, I think Marion also was able to publish other phenomenological works, especially the erotic phenomenon. The idea of the erotic phenomenon. That's one of the latest works of Marion, and then the negative certainties. So I'll draw the central point of Marion, more likely the idea of the man, or the idea of the self in the negative certainties, when he, at the very first chapter, he presented the question concerning the privilege, okay, of the unknowing rather than knowing. So and other serious works also. He published The Reason of the Gift. Marion also became famous because of the dialogue, his dialogue with Derrida in Villanova University. That was in the 1994 or 1993. So the issue there was actually on the idea of the gift, and also because of Derrida, so Marion was also able to gain more readers, okay, and also a lot of people were in a way interested in his view of the gift. And another one also is a compilation of his interviews. The book is entitled The Rigor of Things. So it is there when he more or less summarizes all his ideas, okay, from Descartes down to his theology, down to his phenomenology. So it's a kind of an interview, okay, that tries to summarize his views regarding those three important subjects. Okay, so let me go over the Husserlian Heideggerian phenomenology. So instead of being concerned, for Husserl and Heidegger, instead of being concerned about the relationship between empirical objects out there and their projected images inside the mind, Husserl set aside or bracketed these questions about the existence of objects out there, and instead focused on what actually appears to consciousness in order to analyze how we experience phenomena. So that's the basic understanding of Husserl. The process of bracketing or setting aside certain beliefs or concerns about the world in order to focus more fully on what appears, of course, is called the epoche, or the reduction. So phenomena appear to us within a context, and the context is part of the experience of the phenomenon. Yet, even in attentive examination of what appears and how it appears, aspects of the phenomenon are always hidden. So there are only parts that we see, according to the explanation of Marion. We don't really see the entire object when we experience them. We intuit some of them, like we can see the front of the front part of the table, but not the back part of the table. But then we intuit it to simply say that there is a back part of the table, and then and so on and so forth. So we're not able to see entirely what appears to us. Heidegger, on the other hand, develops his own application of the method, the reduction, coinciding with his attempt to move beyond philosophy as metaphysics to what he perceives to be a comprehensive ontology. So here, for Marion, the distinction between Husserl and Heidegger is the distinction between objects and being. For Husserl, he emphasized on the appearance, on the phenomenon of objects, entities that we experience, while Heidegger emphasized more on the idea of being more than object, so the idea of Dasein. So Marion presents his phenomenology of givenness by using the French word donation, or donation, the term donation. In German, we have the, I don't know if I can pronounce it right, Gegebenheit, or what. So that's the idea of given. So this idea of givenness could be translated as there being present, taking place, or being given. But of course, etymologically speaking, it does mean just simply given. So Husserl was concerned primarily with the constitution of objects. So we constitute objects. All the phenomena he examines are objects which are experienced by a transcendental subject. So we constitute objects. We're able to do that because of our capacity. Through the use of our reason, and so on and so forth. So that's for Husserl. Marion suggests that this imposes parameters and constrictions on these phenomena. For Marion, because we constitute objects, therefore we're able to limit what we know of the object, especially by turning them into objects and making them depend on the constitution of the subject. So kind of like any object would always, any idea of the object would always be dependent on the subject that sees it, on the how the subject sees it, how the transcendental subject able to see the object, and that is because we are the one constituting the objects. It's not the object that constitutes us, but rather us constituting the object. I don't know if it's kind of like similar to Kant. So Heidegger speaks of the being. On the other hand, Heidegger speaks of the being who examines its own being as Dasein and provides an extensive analysis on how Dasein experiences itself and its world, focusing far more explicitly than Husserl on moods, emotions, fears, and what might be called more interior experiences rather than experiences of objects. So Heidegger emphasized more on the idea of anxiety, the idea of angst, death, which are more like internal, interior, than just simply looking at objects in the world. So instead of turning all phenomena into objects, like Husserl did, for Heidegger, the language of being is paramount, and all phenomena become beings or entities for Heidegger. So both Husserl and Heidegger limit the phenomenological project because they impose restrictions on how things are to appear, namely as objects or beings, respectively. So that's where Marion is coming from when he develops the idea of of givenness, the phenomenology of givenness. So he started with trying to present or evaluate the idea of Heidegger and Husserl, and saw that Husserl's and Heidegger's view of phenomenology is quite limiting or limited. So Marion begins by pushing Husserl's and Heidegger's basic phenomenological principles, that every intuition must be received for how it gives itself and within the limits that it gives itself, and a call back to the things themselves, to a more radical and more consistent principle that maintains that the more radically reduction is practiced, the more fully givenness will emerge. So I think the point of Marion is that we're not able to totally see the object as it is in itself. Even if Husserl was able to say, let's go back to the things themselves, but then we're not able to really go back to them because we're able to limit the way we see the objects because we constitute them. So for Marion, we have to radically radically broaden the scope of seeing the object, by not constituting them. I think that's the basic view of Marion. Not to constitute the objects, but let the object appears as it is. There are experiences that we have that we can just simply in awe, we cannot say anything at all. There is no word to describe it. I think that's the basic view of the saturated phenomena when we are being overwhelmed by the intuition that the object presents or gives to us. With that kind of understanding, that kind of view of Marion, I think that's where we get to understand as well the phenomenon of man. When we cannot simply reduce man to simply particular forms, particular kind of concepts or definition. Man is a rational animal. It's no longer the definition, and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of a phenomenon to man that even the man himself as a phenomenon cannot be reduced or cannot be constituted, even by ourselves. That sometimes we are able to realize, that the idea that even if we come to reflect upon things that we did, things that we do, that we are doing, and so on and so forth, we cannot come to the point when we're able to define ourselves. So, so where does authenticity comes in? I'm not sure where we can. Marion would somehow. I don't know why he never mentioned authenticity, because he's coming from Heidegger and Husserl when these two philosophers who really are good in articulating the idea of authenticity, especially Heidegger. But maybe because my understanding is that the very idea of saturated phenomena would actually would limit Marion to really articulate something that is actually a authenticity, more like it's a capacity to define something. Like, we have to define it. But for Marion, we never have to define. We should not define. We should not define what man is. We should not define how we are to be authentic, and so on and so forth. Okay, let me continue. Marion argues that phenomena must be liberated entirely to be given, or to give it themselves on their own terms without any parameters imposed upon them. It's actually very difficult in how you're going to do that, and how you're able to see, and how you're able to let the phenomena appear itself as itself without really constituting it. Because others would say, well, when you see the object, when you try to describe the object, you are delimiting it. You're already limiting. You already limit what you experience, because you're able to describe them normatively or descriptively. So that's one of the problems that people would, raise against Marion. The good example that Marion would always present is the experience of the painting. I remember Heidegger's presentation of what they call the pair shoes, the Van Gogh's, the peasant shoes. No, the idea that when you see the painting, when we are Husserlian, we constitute the painting. We're able to describe the painting, the texture, and so on and so forth. But for Marion, when you look at the painting, in a sense, for you to know really what the painting is in itself, you let the painting overwhelms you. You don't have to. You just have to simply look at the painting, and not constituting the painting, but rather just let the painting present himself. So every now and then, you're able to realize that every time that you go to the same museum, seeing the same painting, the painting changes. I mean, you have different way of looking at the painting. You never see the painting the same again. That's what he would say. That's why we cannot constitute it. We cannot limit it, because every time you go to the museum and see the painting, it's never the same again. So that's the view. Should such phenomena, for example, the idea of painting, simply be excluded from phenomenological investigation, or can we extend the scope of phenomenology to be open to all phenomena as they give themselves, and in the very way they give themselves? So that's the question. Marion contends that the problem is that in Husserl, intentionality plays far too large and imposing a role. So intentionality plays far too large and imposing a role. Intuition is always assumed to be limited and falls short in presenting the phenomenon. So we have intuition, and then we have intentionality. So although intuition is a material that presents to us, but then because we have the capacity to intuit them, we're able to limit the very content of the intuition that we receive from the phenomena or from the experience. Some phenomena are so rich, so overwhelming, give so much to intuition, that we cannot possibly grasp them, certainly not at all at once. So when we're able to see a particular object, when we're able to see, things that really are, when you go to a very beautiful place, you can just simply, you are struck by that place. Okay, that there is no words or word to describe the place, and that is the feeling of we are being overwhelmed by the intuition. You are being overwhelmed by the very object of your own experience of the thing. So there are no adequate concepts for a life-changing event. For a monumental work of art, for the depths of pain, suffering, and joy, or for the encounter with another person. So that's the view. Now I'll go to the idea of saturated phenomena. In the saturated phenomena, Marion would say a phenomenon is saturated in a sense that they cannot be constituted. Okay, that the phenomenon is too much to hold, too much to manipulate, too much to control. There is no way for us, the receiver, to control the intuition that is coming in. So we are being overwhelmed by it. So in many ways, the given phenomenon is like, Marion introduces the idea of anamorphosis, the idea of the accident, accidental landing of the object that there is a feeling of surprise. Okay? You were surprised. Okay? When there is a feeling of surprise, you are, in a sense, you don't have the control over the object, okay? Over the surprise, okay? The object of surprise. So there is kind of like disruption, disruptive, okay, element in the experience of saturated phenomenon. So the phenomenon is without measure. Okay, so this is against Descartes. When Marion would say some phenomenon can be ordered and measured, okay, and that means they are not they are part of our knowledge. But then he would also argue that there are phenomena outside of order and measure, or what we call the matrices universalis in Descartes. There is something outside in that, order and measure that is richer than those that we are able to constitute. So, and these are unrepeatable and excessive. So that's why he named the third book in Phenomenology, In Excess. There is always an excess, okay, to our intuition. It is simply given to us, and we must scramble to deal with it. So it saturates and overwhelms our capacity to understand or give meaning to it, to the point that we cannot provide meaning to those experiences, nor really provide a good description to those experiences. So there are experiences. I mean, even in everyday activity we have, there are part of our experiences that that is outside of order and measure. There are kind of banal activities that cannot be constituted. Okay. So of course, Marion distinguishes between 4 phenomena. Okay, these are phenomena that is abstract, like for example numbers. We don't have real experience of those things, so they are poor in that sense. 4 phenomena are those such as mathematical or technical objects, in which very little is given via intuition, and much of the content has to be supplied via intention. So we can preview or anticipate them with ease, observe them passionately, understand them perfectly. But there is also what we call saturated phenomena, in contrast, escape our grasp. They overwhelm our intuition, provide us with so much that we cannot possibly hold or understand it all. Often, we cannot bear their excess, their brilliance, their dazzling nature. So it is simply concerned with the manifestation of phenomena that are not objects, and for whom the language of objectness or signification makes little sense. They instead provide their own reason and must be analyzed on their own terms. So to explain the very content of his view on saturated phenomena, he uses the Kantian categories, the 4 categories. Now, how these 4 categories, the quantity, the quality, okay, the relation, and the modality, were actually limited, okay, to account for some phenomena that are really excessive in intuition. So there are particular forms of experiences that actually goes beyond, okay, the quantity of the quantity, the category of quantity. So for example, Marion, they give too much in terms of quantity. They give too much, far more than can grasp by intentionality. He uses the example of history. History cannot be entirely comprehended. We cannot totally able to describe, okay, the entire events of history. So he would use history, or say event, as a particular form of phenomena that is saturated, because even event in itself is something that we cannot manage. Okay, there is something that is excessive in the very experience of the event. That's why we think, like for example, that we form we appoint people to organize an event, but then, you know, in the actual event, the event comes in its own. You know, there may be an organizer, but then there are things that we don't have any control over this event. So there is kind of like an access to particular experiences of events. Another one is the category of quality. It is too intense, too brilliant, too overwhelming to be seen. No, it dazzles and blinds us. The phenomenon is experienced most authentically, not when we can constitute it, but when we are submerged in it and overwhelmed by it, the quality in relation to quality. So he would use, for example, the idea of the face of Levinas. The face cannot be constituted. It is something that we don't constitute. So using Levinas's view of the face, something that gives us the idea that, you know, thou shalt not kill. The other, the idea of the other, is infinite. Is infinite. So that's the quality. The third category is the relation. The third category suspends our ability to establish relation between identifiable objects, the experience of the flesh. So here he uses the term flesh, coming also from Husserl and from Levinas, or even from Michel Henry and Merleau-Ponty, when they talk about the idea of the flesh. So in so intimate that no distance intervenes. So for Marion, there is what we call a form of a saturated phenomena when, in terms of understanding the human person, the flesh of the human person, more than the body, because for Marion, the body is something that is biological, it can be organized. Going back to Heidegger, the body is something that can be examined in the microscope, but the flesh is something that is outside of that kind of description. So, and the third one has to do with the modality, the mode of the presentation of the object. Okay, so let me go straight to the idea of the gift. Here, the idea of the gift something to do with kind of like a paradigm in understanding the saturated phenomenon. When for Marion, the gift is a saturated phenomenon insofar as reacting to Derrida. A gift is something that is possible. A gift is not the gift. The gift is not an object. Because when we think of a gift as an object, we reduce the gift as an economic thing, a matter of exchange. So for Derrida, there is no possibility for the gift to occur because it always is conditioned by exchange and so on and so forth. But for Marion, the gift is a saturated phenomenon. It is possible because the gift should be understood not as an object. So, in what sense that it is a gift? It is not an object. So he would more or less do a reduction of the gift, the giver, and the thing being given. So he would use, for example, he would use the example of you know, when someone bestows power over the other, to become a president, that is not a gift, that is an object. When one gives a time to the other, it is a gift, insofar as the time is not an object, that is given. So that's one way of looking at the gift as a paradigm for understanding saturated phenomenon. So right. So the last thing that I want to share is because Marion is very conscious of the idea of order and measure he would always emphasize our capacity to overcome our traditional understanding of what knowing is, or say what they call the imperial character, or what they call the tyranny of reason. That everything is reduced to reason, and that's why he would tend to really argue that not everything can be reduced to reason, not everything can be subject by reason, can be ordered by reason. There are things that goes beyond the capacity of reason to constitute. So in negative certainties, he presented his understanding of man by first introduce the idea of Immanuel Kant, the three important ideas from Kant. What can I know? So that's knowledge. What ought I do? So that's morals. And why may I hope? That's religion. According to Marion, these are, for Kant, are the very important questions that need to be answered, that we need to reflect on. But then he would say it's not the final question. That is really that is not the final question. Rather, the final question is what is man? Because everything now has to do with man. When we speak about what can I know, that refers to man. What ought I do? That also refers to man. And why may I hope? That also has to do with man or human beings. So, and then in the later pages of that first chapter, he would say, and I'd like to quote that this passage has to end my my sharing. I become a question for myself, indeed an aporia for myself, because I discover that I cannot order my own, say, prayer, and thus my own perception correctly, which is to say, voluntarily. If my own prayer and perception, which define my innermost depths, escape my control, then they make me become a question to myself. So I think I get for me, that's a very interesting line from Marion to start with, to start understanding the view of man, as well as our desire to really understand what authenticity is. So I think Marion goes against it when we try to look at authenticity as kind of like a genuine measure. Of course, the question is measure of what? So he would tend to maybe really not to entertain that kind of problem, because there is no really measure for him, against Descartes. There would never be kind of a measure and order in understanding ourselves, kind of like putting up particular normative, or say a framework in understanding who we are as human beings. I think that I end there. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you. I'm so glad that you ended on this problematic nature of man, for that's exactly where we started, and that theme was touched on in each of the presentations. So I guess we can glean from that, some sort of basis for authenticity in the continental tradition has to do with reckoning with the question of man, whether it be in some normative way, whether it involve community, whether it involve ambiguity, or whether it being like, hey, we can't even go there at all. I think we've covered the spectrum here. And I appreciate you going into this saturated phenomenon, this gift. I think with the previous philosophers we covered in this little event, the infinite lies within the subject. and the object is bestowed this sort of infinite quality because of the subject. But here we have the reversal. We find the infinite in the, well, we don't want to call it the object because that would be limiting, but in the phenomena itself, and becoming overwhelmed with that and not trying to seek some purpose in it, I think might allow us to overcome the Western mindset. We're always looking for an end, a purpose, a telos, some sort of cognitive structure or category in it, when a gift is something that someone gives of their own heart without expecting anything back in return. And as someone steeped in anxiety or because of my past experiences, when something is given to me, I always question, are you really, there's no intention behind this, that you're really just giving this because out of love, or no reason whatsoever? I don't believe you. So I think it's important to focus on that in discussing authenticity. Why are we searching for ends and purposes? Why can't we just let the phenomenon be and be awashed in it? That sounds truly baptismal to me. So thank you for honing in on that. Yeah. Or do others have things to say?
But this is always good, when you start off. But Marion's Catholic, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if I can follow into we can't know, because there's all of these theological things going on with Marion. And like Levinas too. So in 2017, so J. Levitt Pearl, he was at Duquesne. I don't know what he's doing right now. He wrote a paper, I forget where it was published. I think it was in a theology journal, about the possibility that that Marion reinscribed sort of heteronormative ideas within postmodern theology, and then so didn't escape the sort of essentializing gestures. Because you see this in Levinas too. Levinas says that the other is feminine in Levinas. So I don't know, you might check that. I think that paper would challenge some of your ideas, but I think you'd probably push back and argue with it. I forget where it was. J. Levitt Pearl is the author.
Yeah.
I'm blanking even on the name of the paper. I'm really doing a bad job at so yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. It might be a fun engagement for you, because I like your Marion. I like what you're driving at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've had charitable presenters tonight. That's great.
I don't know. Why beat each other up?
That's what we're all about in lawn chair philosophy. Yay! Oh.
I just have one question, because I've never read Marion, and this was fascinating to me, and it reminded me a lot of Merleau-Ponty for many reasons. And I was wondering if there is something that he says about the role of language in this impossibility of appropriating the phenomena, and how language in the traditional way of understanding it fails in grasping the phenomena. And that's why Merleau-Ponty says that we need another way of understanding language, as texture or as a
yes. Actually, one of the I forgot the name. There is one a commentator of Marion who actually criticized his lack of attention to hermeneutics actually even the very work of Marion, he never really in a way provide a sufficient or enough discussion on the role of language or even of hermeneutics in his works. So that was the criticism against him, that Marion lacks really what they call the hermeneutical provision in his idea of the saturated phenomena. But then in one of his lectures, I think he also somehow tackles the idea of hermeneutics, evidence and hermeneutics, and how how hermeneutics plays a role in the saturated phenomena. So he would, in his work In Excess, he would consider any kind of particular form of experience, a saturated experience, can be hermeneutically understood, okay, but they are kind of like provisional. They are provisional. There is always kind of like an infinite hermeneutic, especially infinite hermeneutic. There are always any form of understanding the phenomena, although that would not be really, should not be really the case. Okay, but provisionally we do that, okay, to account for our experience. But that is entirely very tentative. That is tentative. That is always it keeps on changing. There is always an infinite interpretation to any kind of phenomena. I think he would have that kind of suggestion. Okay, and maybe I have not really read deeper into Marion's works. No, I'm just that's how I more or less read Marion in Excess. So what actually is paradoxical about it is, when he wrote the erotic phenomenon, the idea of love, okay, which is very important for Marion. That very work itself actually somehow contradicts the very idea of how love. If love is a saturated phenomenon, how come that we're able to account for it? How come that we're able to articulate it? Okay, able to qualify that experience? Because in the erotic phenomenon, he never mentioned any philosopher at all. It was entirely his own experience. Okay, totally his experience of what love is. So, but then he would claim it's more like love can be a saturated phenomenon. Okay, something that you cannot really understand. Okay, but there he suggests he suggests there that love is something like this and like that. So there are internal contradictions in some of his views, and that is recognized by a lot of his readers.
All right, any more final questions or comments or revelations? We good? Okay, well, I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today. I have one commercial thing to do, is that the Lawn Chair Philosophy Foundation has some extra Husserl t-shirts for sale, $15 a pop plus shipping and handling. We have this very serious, speaking of serious people, very serious photo of Husserl, and then the most obnoxious quote from his writings on time consciousness that I could find on the back, properly cited, of course. And actually there were some typos on one. The book was not italicized, so I in Goop underlined it so that it would be proper. I think that gives it more character. So we have those for sale. So thank you for joining us. I will put this on the website. It will serve as an educational tool for those who are unfamiliar with the Continental tradition, and I think this was a great exercise for us who are all up in it already. I had a great time. So I am going to stop recording now, and then I have a couple final words for you three after that, if we're good.